Good afternoon to all the participants for this particular session on fostering empathy and compassion in the classroom. I hope you can clearly hear me. So just give me a thumbs up, probably one. Okay, let's begin formally then. So I would like to begin by welcoming everyone to this particular session. And also, I would like to start by introducing myself as the speaker facilitator for this particular session on empathy and compassion. I'm Dr. Ernie Grio. I have been teaching for more than 3 decades now. Right now, also, I am connected with the School of Education and Human Development of the University of Asia and the Pacific. I handle a couple of programs or specializations in the Master of Arts in Education, specifically Adolescent Development and Education or teaching in the high school and educational leadership or something to do with the work of the principals, something to do with the subject heads, and especially teacher leaders. So today, we're going to look into the importance of creating what we call a culture of kindness. And our gateway or pathway into creating this particular culture that we want to develop, not only in the school, but in all of the classrooms of that particular school where you are working, is compassion and empathy. So the first thing that we need to do then is to look into the importance of the session. Why is this particular session appealing to a teacher, the 38 or rather 38 teachers who have attended this particular session offered by Catalyst? And I would like to have your attention because these two important points are really crucial. We begin with an issue that we need to deal with, something to do with our students, and it has something to do with the issue of bullying. And here, we have a weapon in our hands, a potent weapon or a potent tool in order for us to be able to have a solution to bullying. And you can clearly see, for example, in this particular slide, that this particular motto or slogan makes sense. It's cool for children, for our students, to be kind and not to be cruel, right? And this is a very important point because we all know that in order for us to be able to reduce, to be able to solve the problem of bullying in our classrooms, in our school, we not only have to mobilize our students, but we have to empower them. And empower means the students will have to do the work. And when we talk about doing that particular work, just like what I mentioned a while ago, kindness is something that will help us cure, arrest bullying in our classrooms because kindness is the best protection. But more than a tool, kindness, exemplified by compassion and empathy, builds character. And therefore, in this particular session, then, we have to emphasize the point that in order for us to tackle the issue of bullying in our classrooms, in our school, we have to teach our students to care. Caring is very important. Kindness is very important. We have to build that particular culture. Now, let me go to another point, something that we could relate to, because this particular point is something that we see, something that we experience, something that we take note of even outside of the school, although it is also very important in the school. And this has something to do with what we call the helper's high, which was popularized by an expert in this particular field, Alan Lux, many, many years ago, when he said, when you help someone, you experience a very powerful physical feeling. And that particular powerful physical feeling is characterized by the release of endorphins, These are neurotransmitters, as we all know, that allows us to smile, that allows us or gives an opportunity to smile, to be happy, etc. At the same time, it makes us feel satisfied because of something that we have done that was able to help another person, because we have committed an action that shows kindness or caring to another person. And therefore, it improves our physical and mental health. So two very important points then. In the level of the school, in the context of the school, it gives us a weapon, a very powerful weapon that allows us to combat what we call the issue of bullying. It's cool to be kind. It's not cool to be cruel to someone. At the same time, even outside of the school, in the context of the family, in the context of, for example, our community, in the context of our role as citizens, there is what we call a benefit that we get from helping others. And it has something to do with what we call improvement in our physical health and also in our mental health. And therefore, I ask the question whether did you make a good choice in spending 1.5 hours, 1.5 hours in this particular session, which is basically about creating that particular culture that we want, which is kindness through empathy and compassion. And looking at the 2 points that I raised a while ago, I think it's a good choice. You are here because always in any seminar offered by Catalyst, because you want to make a difference, that particular big difference in the lives of people around you, particularly the students whom you handle. And we all know that the research literature is unanimous in terms of looking at the many findings regarding the most important factor in the learning, the development, and the formation of the educand or the pupil or the student. And that particular most important factor outside of the student is not the curriculum. It is not the textbook, no matter how important the curriculum and the textbook are. It is the teacher, it is you. All right, so we move on and let's take a look at compassion or empathy and compassion from a view of 10,000 feet, because we have to introduce compassion and empathy as something that we are familiar with when we talk about school, when we talk about the curriculum, when we talk about teaching, when we talk about learning, including formation, because it is a part of what we call the SEL or SEL, or the social emotional learning in the classroom. And we all know, we have been exposed to, that there are 5 core competencies in social emotional learning. You can see it here in this particular slide, but we will focus on an important competency that has something to do with kindness, that has something to do with caring, that has something to do with empathy and compassion. And this is what we call social awareness. You are aware of what is happening outside of yourself. So for example, during a collaborative learning group activity, you can actually empathize with the situation of another colleague or peer of yours if you are a student. Or for example, in the context of, let us say, playing basketball, if someone gets hurt, all right, it's something, it's awareness of what is happening or what has happened outside of yourself. Okay, and here it's basically also an ability, and therefore if it is an ability, it can be developed. A person can be developed, can be trained to have social awareness. So we talk about the ability to understand the perspective of another person, perspective taking, or more importantly, to empathize, to place yourself in the shoes of that other person. So here, we already have a clue regarding what empathy is all about. It's not only something that is affective, although that is very important. It's not only a feeling, but it's also a what we call a mental activity, a thinking activity. There's also a cognition or cognitive component of empathy. But besides empathy, it is important also to take into consideration that compassion is basically part and parcel of empathy when we talk about kindness. Because compassion is not only a feeling about the situation or the context or the problem or the issue that another individual person faces right now, but also it spurs, right? It spurs a person into action. So we are looking at not only motivation, but engagement. It's not only something that the person knows, that's something that the person feels, but it is something that allows the person to rationalize and say that I have to do something about it. So compassion is action. So later on, we are going to go deeper into empathy and compassion, or compassion and empathy in that particular sequence. But here, I want us to understand that the key to creating a culture of kindness is basically what we call developing empathy among the students that we have in our classrooms or that we will have in the coming school year. So it's about feeling into and thinking about affective and cognitive, right? But as important as empathy, okay, because it is connected to empathy, is compassion. Because it drives a person to do something about that particular feeling or thinking, to alleviate, for example, the suffering of another person, or to help another person, or to provide assistance to another person. And here, therefore, when you talk about compassion, when you talk about action, many things, many events, for example, in our classrooms, in the context of school, come to mind. And we realize that these particular virtues, the virtues of empathy, okay, and compassion are important, They have to be included in a so-called curriculum, a curriculum of character education that we need to emphasize and that we need to teach. We need to plan, we need to implement, we need to evaluate, and we need to reflect on. So let's move on and let's take a look at a couple of objectives for this particular module. The first module will talk about the views of experts about what empathy is, about what compassion is, and how they complement one another. The other objective talks about developing strategies on how to foster empathy and compassion based on these particular views. Now, let's try to qualify what the expert is or who the expert is. The expert is not only someone who is a researcher. Many of the things that will be included in this particular module are views coming from practitioners, validated by experts. So practitioners validated by experts, meaning to say it is what works in the real world. These things, these techniques, methods, and approaches work in the real world. In fact, as early as the first one in explaining the views of experts about the need for creating that culture of kindness through empathy and compassion, we will already include approaches. When we say approach, general, from the perspective of the entire school. And here, in order for us to be able to have a concrete understanding of compassion and empathy, I will be presenting 4 best practices coming from schools of character that have been given an award as schools of character by CEP Philippines, or Character Education Partnership Philippines. At the same time, I dug deep into my own experience, reflecting on my own experience as a teacher, reflecting on the notes coming from colleagues many years ago, and basically recently because of my interaction with my graduate school students in their work in their respective schools, I've also compiled a lot of techniques that has something to do with developing empathy and compassion from a perspective called relationships. Later on, I will explain. So at the very beginning, even though we're going to explain the views of experts, we will already include techniques and strategies in the level of the classroom and approaches in the level of the school or the school unit. For example, a primary school or a high school. So these are the objectives. I would like now to give you probably a minute to think about your own objectives. Why did I choose this particular session? What are my objectives or what were my objectives? Do these objectives align with the objectives that are presented now regarding the views and regarding the strategies? So I'll give you a minute to think about it. If you want, you can write them down and send them to the chat box. All right. So let's move on. And I hope we have an alignment of your personal objectives and the module objectives for this particular session. So we now look into the essential question that we need to answer in this particular session, in this particular module. And this essential question strikes at the very heart of what compassion and empathy are all about, or what creating a culture of kindness is all about. So if empathy and compassion are of value, how might how might we set out to cultivate these virtues in our students? And look at the second one because that is very important, and ourselves as teachers. Because we have to take a look at the fact that when we talk about the teacher, as we all say in values education, is the hidden curriculum. In fact, the teacher is the most important curriculum, not the document. But when we not only teach, for example, with the knowledge of the content, no matter how important that is, or a knowledge of pedagogy in delivering that particular content that we know, but we teach with our lives. We teach with our lives, okay, our own life. So we have to be trying our very best. We always have to try our very best to be an exemplar of compassion and empathy. And this is the reason why many of the techniques, or rather all of the techniques that I will include in part one of this particular session, follows that particular framework when it talks about relationships. Because I think when you talk about caring, empathy, compassion, respect, and all the other virtues that we need to develop among our students, we have to take into consideration the importance of relationships in the context of the classroom and in the context of the school. So again, if empathy and compassion are of value, how might we set out to cultivate these virtues in our students and starting with ourselves? So what is your essential question? What is your essential question? You can go back to your objectives and then come up with your own essential question. This particular question will recur naturally throughout this particular session because our goal is not only to understand empathy and compassion, the definition, the importance, what the research is telling us, but definitely how do we cultivate these virtues in our students? Whether you're handling grade 1 or grade 5, or for example, in the senior high school, and maybe some of you, like me, in the graduate school or in the university. So what is your essential question? Let me just fix this one. So let's move on. So before we discuss empathy and compassion, we take a look before we take a look at the definition of empathy and compassion, because the definition will give us a deeper understanding of what empathy and compassion are. We now take a look at the importance of empathy and compassion. And in order for us to have a peek into the importance of empathy and compassion, let's take a look at the school of character practice that I will highlight. So there are several schools that have been given this particular title or award of School of Character by the Character Education Partnership Philippines. And there were occasions when I accompanied Mr. Rentoy as one of the accreditors. And I think this particular practice gives us a hint regarding the importance of developing a culture of kindness and compassion and empathy. There are various programs in this particular school that tries to develop empathy and compassion. And in these various programs, there is always what we call the individual level of making sure that you reflect on that particular virtue of empathy and compassion that the school is trying to develop among the students. So the students submit reflection papers. So for example, the students, sometimes they do an FGD, or the student, for example, sometimes is interviewed or coached or mentored by the teacher about that particular virtue. But in this particular school, what attracted my attention is a commitment on the part of the students to do an action that that particular action is something that showed kindness to a person. They commit to character. There is what they call a student response wall. And in that particular wall, okay, there is something that is written, perhaps a sentence that has something to do with compassion, something to do with empathy, and the students will publicly declare that they agree with this particular principle, with this particular action, and that they commit to doing this particular action. So this is one practice. Now, in order for us to have a better understanding then of compassion and empathy, let's explore some angles regarding why do we have to cultivate a culture of kindness, beginning with the culture of kindness. And we'll take a look at it from three angles. Number one, from the parents, stakeholders, very important stakeholders in the school. From experts, researchers, and from the practitioners, we, the teachers. So we begin, and you will be surprised. You will probably be startled with these particular findings, with these particular points that will be presented now, beginning with number one. What do parents want? In one study, 80% of parents agreed with the statement, "It's more important that my children are kind, caring, respectful to others than become successful academically." Three-quarters of these parents said that they often worried that the world is an unkind place for children. So it is something that resonates with parents. So when you talk about building a culture of kindness, propagating a culture of kindness, that we want our children, our students to be kind and caring persons, it is something that parents agree with. So it is important for the parents. Let's now take a look at it from the perspective of the teachers in one study. Now, here is a grave concern for teachers. And this particular grave concern is basically something that leads to burnout. And we all know that when a teacher is burned out, that particular teacher may resign, may actually leave the profession. And here, when you talk about student-related violence, quote unquote, okay, it has something to do, okay, with indiscipline, bullying, and disruption. And a while ago, okay, in the first slide, we talk about an antidote to bullying, a potent weapon, a very powerful weapon. And that particular weapon is character education. And that particular character education program is centered on kindness, on caring. And we have to realize that when we talk about the number one reasons why teachers, for example, leave the profession, in this particular study, the pay is not number one. The number one reason has something to do with culture. And that particular point, okay, regarding the culture, the teachers identified pervasive indiscipline for leaving the profession. So just imagine, for example, if this particular program that you have in your school, targeting kindness, targeting compassion, that the character education program in general will work, then it will allow us to retain teachers, especially the good teachers. So we have more. Let's take a look at it from the perspective of the experts and later on educational leaders. In a survey of 272 global thinkers from around the world, they said there are 5 values that are very important for the schools to develop. And take a look at those values. One of them is compassion. Of course, when you talk about respect, it also has something to do with kindness. So compassion. And here, the educational leaders agreed. The educational leaders agreed. What would students need to know and be able to do, and what behaviors would they need to thrive during the next century? This is 2001, so in the 21st century. Civility and ethical behavior. They were on the list side by side with math and science. All right? So let's have a metaphor magic. This is an example of a metaphor. I would like now to give the participants, my colleagues, to come up with a mental image that captures the importance of kindness, considering what we have learned from the perspectives or angles of the teacher, the parent, and then, of course, the educational leaders and the experts. So teaching kindness is like because a couple of minutes. What could be a metaphor that could basically capture the importance of teaching kindness or creating a culture of kindness through compassion and empathy? You can write your metaphor in the chat box. Hopefully later on at the tail end of this particular module, I will be able to take a look at them. And we will be able to talk about the metaphor, including your comments later on. So what is the importance of cultivating a culture of kindness in terms of a metaphor? All right. So we move on and let's now take a look at the views of the experts regarding compassion and empathy. And we will begin with compassion. So before we begin with compassion, just like a KWL, so imagine introducing yourself to someone in this particular in this particular group of teachers, maybe. So what do you already know about compassion? It's like the K in the KWL. And then what do you want to know about compassion? So just a minute. What is compassion? What do I know about compassion? And what do I want to know about compassion? So here is what we call the etymological meaning of compassion. Compassion means to suffer with. Therefore, from that etymological meaning or etymology, when we talk about compassion, it is to empathize or to feel with. To empathize or to feel with. Meaning to say you go out of yourself. You take a look at what is happening, okay, with your classmate, with a peer, and if you think about this, this is really important and very important. If you take a look at the daily situations that occur in the classrooms. So, for example, number one, when you talk about the cafeteria, when you when you see someone, for example, looking for a table that will he will choose a table that he will choose and to stay there and to take, for example, lunch with a group of people. And maybe that particular person is hesitant to come over and join you in that particular table. But because you recognize, you empathize, you feel, for example, his anxiety or issue or problem, you call that particular student to come and join you. You invite him. Or, for example, number two, during classroom discussion, classroom recitations, when a student, for example, commits a mistake, okay, where what would be your reaction, especially if you actually can empathize or feel with the probably the stress that that particular person feels when he came up with that particular wrong answer. So this is the definition, to empathize or to feel with. But here, when you talk about compassion, we have to go further, and let's take a look at a classic book, Educating for Character. Because in that classic book, what is emphasized is the powerful role of emotions or feelings. The powerful role of emotions and feelings. Because when you talk about emotions and feelings, okay, it's not only about empathizing or understanding the person, but you suffer with the person. And when you suffer with the person, the book clearly tells us that you have a certain responsibility that you need to do. And you feel that responsibility. Therefore, compassion is something that drives a person to action. So it's not only a matter of feeling something, but it's a matter of suffering with someone. And therefore, it impels you, it drives you, it motivates you to do something in order to alleviate the suffering of that particular person. All right. So for example, number one, okay, you call on that particular probably classmate of yours to come and join you in that particular table. Or number two, when a certain classmate commits a mistake during discussion recitations, you don't actually laugh at him. All right. So there is an action on your part. And that particular action is because of the fact that there is motivation on your part. That action is the engagement. It could be affective, it could be behavioral, it could be cognitive. But it all started with that particular motivation brought about by compassion. So let's take a look at another practice in a school of character that will give us a better idea regarding what compassion is all about. In this particular school of character, they have what we call in their program a character education program in their shoes. Okay, taking the perspective of someone in their shoes. So this particular character education program is implemented inside the classrooms. It is integrated into the curriculum, particularly in social studies, in literature. So they look at certain case studies or they apply what they have learned in order for them to be able to take the perspective of someone else, someone who is different from them. But another important program that basically complements in their shoes and basically gives us a clear idea of what compassion is all about is share a meal. Share a meal. Okay? Because it talks about action. It talks about raising funds for your classmates who probably have no capability to buy, okay, meals for themselves, for example, in the cafeteria. So there is action on your part. It's not only about thinking or feeling about something, but when you feel or think about that something, about the suffering of another person, you do something about it. You do something about it. So in their shoes and share a meal. So here, compassion looks and sounds familiar because when we talk about compassion, then what we need to understand and what we need to relate to is what we call motivation. So compassion motivates people to do something. And that something is an act of kindness. That something is an act of kindness. That something, if it is an act of kindness, shows that a certain person cares about another person. And here, motivation, I said, is something that we could easily relate to because we actually employ motivational tools and techniques when we teach. We actually see, number two, we actually recognize the importance of motivation in the learning of our students, particularly when we employ the academic curriculum, when we implement the academic curriculum. We talk about motivation as students owning the lesson, owning the unit. If there's no ownership, if there is no voice, no choice, for example, then there could be a problem, a breakdown in the learning. But here then, we realize that it's the same thing in character formation or character education. There has to be motivation. It cannot stay, for example, as a mental state or thinking, or it cannot stay, for example, as feeling something about it. The students will have to be spurred to action. And when they are spurred to action, they own it because they understand it. And they don't only understand it from a cognitive perspective, but they actually feel that they need to do it because it is their responsibility. So let's take a look at a few techniques worth looking into. And here, I would like now to go down to the level of the classroom. I would like to focus on the teacher. I would like to focus on our work as teachers. And I said a while ago, it has something related to relationships or building relationships. Or in other words, if a teacher would like to cultivate empathy and compassion among the students that he handles inside the classroom, I think it is important to always emphasize what we call promoting belongingness. Because when we promote belongingness, it implies that everyone in that particular classroom that we handle is important to us. That particular student, okay, he has a name, not only a number, not only a surname, is important to us. So let's now take a look at these particular techniques. So example, when you are teaching, when you are talking to your students, do you make eye contact with them? Because it is important. When you make eye contact with them, you're telling that particular person that you are important to me. Or for example, do you only do you correct your students, and we have to, when they commit a mistake or when they commit an infraction? But do we also focus on the positive things? Do we commend them? Do we notice them? Because teacher noticing is not only about noticing students who are not paying attention, or noticing students, for example, who did something wrong. Teacher noticing is a very important skill. But inside the classroom or even outside of the classroom, we should also notice the good things, the good deeds that have been that our students have committed. And the third one is, do we teach students to admit when they commit a mistake? And do we tell them to apologize? And do we teach them how to apologize? So in the level of the classroom, these are certain techniques that we need to consider. Because when we talk about compassion, empathy, it begins with us. If we are going to cultivate the virtues of compassion and empathy among our students, we should also make sure that it begins with us, meaning to say that we struggle to have these particular virtues. And when you have that particular mindset and heart set of making sure that in my classroom, everyone belongs in my classroom, that the student identifies himself with this particular classroom because I place importance on the person. And these are some things or some techniques in the level of the classroom. So what are other techniques? What are other techniques? So in the level of the school, we have seen about that student response wall. In the level of the school, in their shoes, but more importantly, because of compassion, share a meal. And a while ago, in the level of the classroom, promoting belongingness. So what are other techniques? So let's move on and let's take a look at empathy. So the other side of the coin. So this time, grab that spoon, and in grabbing that spoon, okay, I want everyone to think about the connection between compassion and empathy. A while ago, we had a peek into that particular connection, okay? But in order for you to start thinking about it, okay, try to come up with a review question, something that is specific to the connection between compassion and empathy. So a while ago, I said empathy leads to compassion. A while ago, I said when you talk about empathy, it's about placing yourself in the shoes of another person. But when you talk about compassion, you suffer with the person. And because you suffer with the person, okay, you you create you create a certain reason for you to act on it, to come up with something, to you are motivated to come up with something that will help that particular person in order to alleviate his suffering, his pain, or improve his condition. So what could be a good review question that actually establishes a link between compassion and empathy? So recall suffering with, in empathy, a feeling into, a feeling into. You understand the feelings or the emotions of another person. And when you take a look at that particular point regarding a feeling into, it's not only something that is affective, but it is also something that is cognitive because you create a mental picture. Okay, if you go back to that particular point regarding the student looking for a table where he could probably sit down and take his lunch, etc., right? You form a mental picture. You come up with a recognition from an intellectual perspective, a cognitive perspective, that this particular person needs a place, needs a space, and that particular place and space is a place where he is welcome, where he can actually be safe. Okay, he can actually talk to people in that particular table. So at the same time, you look at the fact that you're feeling into that if that particular student will not be able to find that particular place, right? Then it it is something it is something that is not conducive to him. Conducive because, okay, it will basically allow him not to interact with people around him. So feeling into. And I would like now to look into compassion and empathy again by highlighting a technique regarding building what we call belongingness or relatedness. Okay. So for example, when conversing with students, you ask questions when they talk about their hobbies, interests, friends, because you're interested in them. Or take a look at this particular technique when you teach them to be gracious winners in class activities because they're mindful of the feeling or the reactions of their classmates, right? So in the level of the school again, there is what we call, okay, empathy and compassion. In a school where we visited, they have a program that has something to do with this particular motto that is very familiar to us. There's no student left behind. It is familiar to us because we think about grades, we think about performance, we think about passing the subjects. But in this particular school, they extended it to the point that no student left behind because we will try to address economic inequality. We will try to extend help to the students of ours who are actually find themselves probably lacking textbooks, find themselves probably lacking uniforms. And there is a drive on the part of the school, on the part of the students to come up with these particular materials that students need. And even before the pandemic, that particular motto regarding no student left behind is not only about academics, it's also about promoting the well-being of the students. Are there instances of bullying? Are there instances of cliques being formed? And what do we do about it? Are some students being excluded, for example, of because of certain reasons, etc.? And this is a clear example of empathy and compassion because there is action, especially when you talk about compassion. So when we take a look at the importance of empathy, it's about attuning yourself to a person. So you actively listen, you observe, and you focus on another because you resonate with that particular person's context. And here, okay, empathy, compassion, and empathy, particularly compassion, they come together. Because if you take a look at this particular slide, it's quite clear. Okay, if you feel pity for someone, there's nothing virtuous about feeling bad. So empathy. Okay. For compassion to have any substance, you have to do action. You have to convert that into action. And if you do that, a regular action, it becomes a habit, it becomes a virtue. It becomes a virtue. So they are related. They are related. And when empathy and compassion, when they come together, okay, you have a good chance of creating that culture of kindness. We have a good chance of creating a culture of kindness. So here are a few more techniques. Number one, number two, and number three. So take a look at number two. You model how to argue with someone in a respectful manner. Okay, I can take your perspective. Maybe I don't agree with you, right? But I can take your perspective. I can try to understand you. And then compassion, I will argue with you in a manner that I will preserve your dignity as a person. Or take a look at the first one. Okay. You inquire about an event not only because that particular event has something to do with bullying or any other infraction, but also because someone has showed kindness to another person. Or for example, take a look at the last one. You pay attention to other people's needs, especially outside of the school, in your family, in your community, in your circle of friends or barkada. Because just like what I said a while ago, when we talk about in the level of the classroom, it's all about belongingness, relatedness, identity. It's all about relationships. The teacher can prove compassion by making sure that he tries his very best to practice the virtues that he wants the students to develop. And then we have the level of the school, the three practices that I have mentioned. So what are other techniques? What are other techniques? Right. So we will now take a look at part two. And in part two, we're basically asking the questions: do teachers or schools play a crucial role in the attempt to create that particular culture that we want, a positive culture, a strong culture of kindness? And the answer is clearly yes, because we have seen it, for example, in the research findings at at the beginning of this particular module. And for example, we have seen it in the best practices of the schools of character and in the techniques in the level of the classroom that I have laid down based on that particular framework, that it is important to have relationships, good relationships in the level of the classroom, relationships between the teacher and the students and their peers or classmates. And I would like to begin in terms of answering this particular question by looking at a couple of models that that the literature has told us to be effective, to have an impact in the quality of learning on the part of the students, particularly in developing compassion and empathy. We'll take a look at a couple of models, one in high school and one in college. In high school, or rather in college, we begin with design thinking. And in design thinking, you in this particular class in higher education in digital marketing, they went through that particular point of coming up with what they call an empathy map. It is a part of the technique called persona. And here they were trying to understand the aspirations, the concerns, the needs, and the interests of the customer. So in that empathy map, okay, points like number one and number two were basically common, meaning to say you always look at the customer from this particular perspective. So, for example, what does the customer see in the environment, in the store? Or what does the customer think and feel when that particular customer comes into the store or inside the store? So, for example, if you're selling sneakers, but in that empathy map, in this particular model, it became effective in developing empathy and compassion. Hopefully, they'll do something about it because in that map, two very important categories were included. Number one was the pain. What were the pitfalls that the customer will get into, for example, in trying to understand or trying to take a look at the fact that this is this brand for me, etc. And then what are the gains? What does the customer really want? So when you talk about that particular question, then whether do schools matter, even in the level of the academic curriculum in teaching empathy and compassion, schools matter. Let's take a look at another example in high school. So this one has something to do with what we call the 4 E's in service learning, a twist, okay? A certain variation in service learning. It's called the 4 E's empathy building model. So the first 2 E's and the third E, exposure, awareness, explanation, you understand. Because in this particular 4 E's, the point is you should be able to understand a group of people who are actually different from you. You have to understand a group of people who are actually different from you. So in this particular journal article, it was implemented in a neighborhood wherein that particular neighborhood is a poor neighborhood. And the students did service learning in that particular neighborhood. So they actually participated in the daily living of the people in that neighborhood. And they also have what we call self-assessment of their level of empathy. Okay, and it worked because in this particular model, when it was implemented, it did increase the level of empathy of the students towards the people whom they not only try to understand, but they actually spent moments with. Nakihalubilo sila. All right. So it did work. And maybe because we have no time here, you can also check out what we call a method called Project Soapbox in the high school curriculum. This is also something that may work in your school. So will it work? Design thinking, that particular empathy map, or the 4 E's empathy building model? It works, right? So the question now is, what are the strategies that we can probably implement in the school based on the views of experts that may work in creating that particular culture of kindness through developing the virtues of compassion and empathy? And schools do matter. Schools do matter. So we have decades of evidence demonstrating that empathy is shaped by experience, including that particular experience that we are familiar with, right? The students connecting with the content, the students experiencing instructional activities, the students experiencing group activities or interactions with the teacher, etc. And in fact, there's a crucial information here. Nurture on the part of the teachers, okay, matter even more for children who are at the greatest risk of dropping out of school. So let's now take a look at these particular strategies. And we will highlight here 4 strategies pertaining to number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. So we have quality learning experience. How do we develop compassion and empathy through quality learning experience? How do we develop compassion and empathy or a culture of kindness from the perspective of an entire school? So an entire school program. And how do we develop culture and kindness from the perspective of a teacher, not only as a professional, but a person? And of course, we have to take into consideration the role of parents as partners. So the first strategy then that we would like to point out is something that comes from a very good book. Came out to 2010, authored by Jaron Lanier. And this particular book is entitled You Are Not a Gadget. And he advocated in this particular book that the aim of a school is to be able to expand that circle of empathy. The aim of a school, according to Lanier, is to be able to expand that circle of empathy. You have to go beyond your class or classmates, or specifically, you have to go beyond your friends. You have to go beyond the people whom you know. I know that kindness, empathy, compassion starts with people around you whom you care for. with the family, with friends, etc. But for Lanier, in this particular book, that particular aim must be able to expand the circle. And if we think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense because when you talk about uh, students later on leaving school, when they become citizens, that particular virtue of empathy and compassion should not only be something that they practice with people whom they care for, who are friends or family members, but many times to strangers, people whom you don't know. But precisely because you want to promote their good, their or the common good, then you practice that particular virtue with them. So this is the aim of the school. And in giving giving well life to this particular aim of the school, I think it is important from the perspective of school leaders, or not necessarily only school leaders or those who are in a position of authority, but also teacher leaders, and we are all teacher leaders, that when we take a look at classroom level policies, school policies, we always have to ask the question, what is the purpose of that particular policy? Who does it help? For example, who does it help in terms of developing that particular culture of kindness or inculcating that particular virtue of compassion or empathy? And at the same time, who does it harm? In other words, is it kind? In other words, is it kind? All right. So the school, the level of the school. Now, the question now is, how do you describe your school's kindness campaign? What is the purpose of that particular kindness campaign? Who does it help? Does it harm anyone? Is it kind? Does it promote what Lanier had mentioned a while ago regarding expanding that circle of empathy or that circle of compassion? So this is a question that needs to be, well, you need to reflect on when you talk about the a strategy that has something to do in the level of the school. So let's take a look at the second one, the parents. Successful character education programs always have or have had a specific parent involvement components. So the question now is, how do we engage the parents? How do we engage the parents? How do we make them own the character education program? How do we make them actively participate and own the program, to collaborate with the school, to collaborate with the teachers and the officers? How do we make them efficacious, that they have the knowledge and the skills and the abilities and the values and the dispositions? How do we train them? How do we call them to action? So there has to be what we call a homeschool connection, a homeschool collaboration. There has to be a connection between the home and the school. So meaning to say, a a program that cultivates a culture of kindness will not succeed unless the parents or the families are involved. Unless the parents and the families are involved. So there is a need to engage the parents. So these are the things that, okay, we have to ask ourselves. Do they know the direction of the school? Do they know the core values of the school? Do they receive regular feedback from the school about their children, not only in the area of academics, but in the area of character formation? Are they willing to collaborate with the teachers in order to promote the character education program? So that's the second one. The third one that we can take a look at is who the teacher is matters a lot. So again, we go back to that hidden curriculum, or the most important factor in the learning, development, and formation of the student outside of the student in the context of the school, not the family, none other than the teacher. So we have to emphasize the key role of the teacher. And here, I would like to go back then to the importance of relationships, that particular point regarding the caring teacher, the teacher who demands a lot from the students or from his students. But in demanding, that particular teacher shows warmth and care. So meaning to say, he or she is a warm demander. All right. He or she is a warm demander. So without good relationships, then most probably what we teach inside the classroom or even outside of the classroom is basically sabotage. It's basically sabotage. So it is important for the teacher to take note of the fact that I am not only teaching content, or in order to teach the content, I should have good relationships with my students. They trust me because they know that what I have in mind is always their good, their own good. So what we need then is the warm demander, or what we call the empathetic teacher. And that particular empathetic teacher actually uses empathetic teaching. So in this particular book, published in 2011, it talks about that particular teaching that teachers need to master in order to help students develop empathy, because they can see in their teacher that particular virtue. They can sense it, they can see it, and they can reflect on it based on the actions of the teacher. So that particular teacher, for example, number one, okay, employs what we call, it is important for the students to own the lesson. So he communicates the objectives to the students. He makes sure that the students not only understand the objective, but actually the objective becomes a glue to their learning. It drives the students because of that particular objective, because that particular objective is important to them. Or an empathetic teacher who employs empathetic teaching, make sure that the students are heard in his classroom. They are seen and heard. They are not invisible. So they have a voice and they have a choice. So for example, I don't know, maybe assignment, performance tasks, coming up with a rubric, there is active participation on the part of the students, because it not only promotes their academic learning or learning of the content of the curriculum, whether big ideas, whether knowledge or skills, but also they develop the values. And of course, the everyday contact with the teacher. So the teacher comes to school on time or comes to class on time because he respects the students. Or for example, the teacher makes sure that he combs his hair properly, or he makes sure that he comes in an attire that shows what we call voice on the part of the teacher, because he gives importance to the students. Or when the teacher calls on the student, that particular, he knows the name or the nickname of that particular student. He does not call the student by looking at the class number and say, number 8, you are number 8. Or when the student commits a mistake, the teacher corrects the student in such a way that that particular correction will lead to an understanding of the lesson, but at the same time, okay, it is something that is formative. This particular book, Empathy in Education, published in 2011, gives us a clear understanding, because it gives us, we can infer a lot of techniques and strategies by looking at the concepts. All right, 60-second action plan. How can I be a warm demander? Okay, because we have to demand from our students, we have to have high expectations from them. But at the same time, when we demand, okay, we have to support them. We have to extend the necessary support that they need. So how can I be a warm demander in order for me to become the empathetic teacher that I need to become, or do the empathetic teaching that I need to implement inside the classroom? And let's take a look at the last one, which is what kind of teaching matters a lot. This is the quality learning environment. And it is something that has what we call agency as a goal. When we talk about agency as a goal, then we take a look at the student as something that is a doer, as someone who is a doer, as someone who does not only passively, for example, sit inside the classroom and listen to the teacher, but is someone who actively listens, actively participates, actively collaborates with his peers or with his classmates. So therefore, he has control over what he or she does inside the classroom. Because when you talk about agency, you talk about control, right? So when you talk about control, then the teacher must be able to see the student and hear the student, or provide the student with a voice or a choice. And this is something that we need to do, something that we need to do. Because when you talk about building empathy and compassion inside the classroom, it begins with the fact that when we take a look at the person, he has something, he is someone who can control his his activities, his actions inside the classroom. So it is teaching with agency as a goal. And when we look further into this particular type of teaching, particularly in coming up with that quality learning experience, we realize, for example, that as clear examples, number one, if I have a rubric, it is not only important that the students understand what the rubric is all about, but perhaps because they are capable of doing so, that they can actually contribute in coming up or completing the rubric. Or number two, if I have pre-work for them before our face-to-face discussion, maybe in that particular pre-work, they have a choice. There are three levels of pre-work, and they will choose the pre-work that basically is aligned with their level of ability, following differentiated instruction. But I think here, when we teach with agency as a goal, we realize then that our students are capable individuals, that we actually believe in them, we believe in their capability. And therefore, in that particular classroom, we promote responsibility. And then we also promote empathy, especially when we talk about collaborative learning group activities, right? So, from the perspective of the school, expanding that circle of empathy. When we talk about, for example, the teacher, the empathetic teacher, we have to engage the parents. There has to be a connection between the home and the school. And here, the kind of teaching that we need is something wherein it allows the students opportunities to learn. And because they have those opportunities to learn, right, they develop that agency.